So now I've spoken about all the different elements, I start thinking about the track as a whole. Strangely, on this track, I ended up doing the drums last, which is not necessarily how I normally do it. I think a lot of people might even start with the drums. I really knew that I wanted this track to be based around the string riff, and then I felt like the sub bass was very important to what the strings are doing, so I ended up doing that next, and then that left the drums to do. But sometimes you might start with the drums and then build from there. That's just how I went with this track. So here on the left you can see essentially this is all my ideas, just all on top of each other. You can hear that crazy bass sound that I made earlier, which might have just sounded ridiculous on its own, starts to make more sense when you've got everything there together. So the way I work, once I've sort of just put together this big chunk of ideas and thought about things in a very individual way, I then move over to the right here and start thinking about arranging my track. And actually this is where it can get really fun now. I like to use markers, as I mentioned before, because it helps me just to visualize what's going on. So after a little bit of playing about, I actually decided the way I wanted this track to start was just with the drums and the bass. So having written the string riff first, I've actually decided to not start with it because I just felt this was such an impactful way to start the track. So a couple of loops of that. You noticed I've used all the bass sounds at once and all the drum sounds really, and it just sort of hits you in the face. And then to complement this, after a couple of loops of that, I thought I'm going to drop right down to that, the first thing I wrote, which was that solo violin that sounds like it's coming out of a gramophone. So you go from this really big drum and bass loop down to this really classical sounding old style violin, and I liked the juxtaposition of that. In my music though, I always like to keep things happening all the time. You can't just let something loop forever and not introduce something else, because to me it's boring. So after one loop of that violin, I thought I'd bring the claps in. And you notice at the end of that, we have the rolling snare and the tail end of that crazy bass, because both those things give the sense of something's coming, what's coming next. What is coming next, which I called V1, verse 1, but you know, until someone writes some rapping to this, who knows what this could be. But I felt like this next section, I wanted to bring the beat and the riff together, but not in a big way. So this is what I ended up with. So to explain what I did there, I dropped this kick 2. You can see it's gone because the kick 2 was that sort of distorted sounding kick, which was too much for this section. So I just wanted that punch kick. Kept the claps in because it's grime and we need lots of claps going on. Drop the snare. I think I kept the hi-hat as well. And this is where, if you remember that spizzicato string sound, I thought this is the time for that to shine. So if you hear that with those drums. And to me, this is possibly the most grimy sounding part of the track. But the final little bit, we just popped the sub bass in. I lost that sort of growly bass and the crazy bass and just left us with the sub bass. Here how the kick drum and the sub bass are working really nicely together. Developed it, I brought the growl bass in. Finally, the crazy bass. I then knew I wanted to go big, so this is kind of where I just threw the kitchen sink at it and just chucked everything in. That octave string come in and make it really exciting. So you notice you go for it's kind of just the transition from section to section. We've got this just rhythmical intro, followed by the solo violin, followed by this sort of real downbeat verse, followed by this big section. So you can see basically the way I go about it is I start by making all the elements of my track and don't particularly think about structure or anything like that. And then once I've got all these elements, I can just work through and just drop things in and out and start to make a fairly interesting piece of music.